Today, I had the great pleasure to speak once again with James Douma, who is a longtime computer expert since the 1980s, and we actually talk about that today, and also someone who really understands Tesla from the inside out. We talked about Teslabot, we talked about full self-driving, we talked about computing back in the early 1980s, late 1970s. We talked about how chimpanzees, in some cases, are better than human beings at certain kinds of tasks, and we even talked about whether Teslabot will dream. Let's take a look. But I thought I would actually, because I watched your Tesla Herbert interview, which you did just a couple of days ago, right? That I watched that, and so I heard your story about the Trash 80 and being on your knees at Radio Shack and whatever. Yeah. So I got to tell you my little story to connect up with that, and then we can. I think you'll appreciate this.
Cool.
So my parents as well were not particularly well off. And I had the really good fortune, however, of living within walking distance of a library and a Radio Shack when I was a kid. And this has nothing to do with the Radio Shack, but what it does have to do with is what I learned to program on was a TI-35 calculator, which was the old with the red, it had the red on that thing.
I had one, yeah.
Yeah, it had, I think it was 35 lines of programming and no memory. It didn't have constant memory. So I would literally write down the programs. I'd figure out how to I had games and things like that I figured out in like 35 lines of code, wrote them down on a piece of paper, kept them in a folder, and then I would turn the thing on, and it was just double A's. It didn't have rechargeable batteries, so you had like this limited window. So I'd madly type in the code, play the game, whatever, until the battery died, and then I would have to start the whole process over. So it was not quite as crazy as your assembler story. And by the way, if people haven't seen that other interview, you talked about how you basically learned what was it, Z86 assembler?
Z80 assembler.
Yeah, Z80. So I mean,
speaking
of being geeks, so there you go.
you could. There was a great, the command line when you turn on TRS-8. It's just a basic prompt. You can type in a program and run it or whatever the deal was, and so I got the little, Radio Shack had the little programmer's guide or whatnot, which is this little binder thing. And I bought a copy of it and I took it to school and I read it. And the possibilities were just like, oh my God, you can do anything like that. I didn't know about Turing complete machines at the time, right? This was my first exposure to like, wow, you could actually do anything with this. Like it can do, but then when I started actually writing stuff, there were all kinds of things that were just so painfully slow. And I learned at some point that basic isn't that's not the metal, right? Like there's a layer down underneath that. And so I found out how to CPU, and I went and I bought the reference manual on the CPU, and I read about the same CPU, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. This is just like the greatest thing ever. I can't believe people thought of this thing. And I just read it over and over again. And at some point, because I found myself thinking, well, what if you wanted to do this? Like, how would you do that? And then, work it out in the machine code or something. And at some point, I just read through it so many times that if I wanted to like knock together a little assembly program in my head, like I'd read all those pages 20 times, right? And I knew all the opcode formats, so where the bits were. So I could sit down on a sheet of paper and, compile it. Then I'd convert the values into hex. And when I wanted to test my idea out, I could go down to, they had these peek and poke commands in BASIC,
right,
where you could write an exact value to an address. And so I could just peek them in there. And then they had a basic command that would just like jump to the start of the program, right? And then, of course, debugging is really fun because if you get it wrong, the computer just crashes. Right. And then you sit there and you think really hard about what could have gone wrong, and then you try it again.
Yeah, I think people kind of miss that, like especially when you did assembler, there was no sandboxing. You were literally writing on the, it was more or less writing on the silicon, like you said. It's if you screwed up, it was like it's gone. And even BASIC, if I'm remembering correctly, would have instances where you could overload the memory and it didn't sandbox the memory, so it would crash the computer. Like if you had a memory leak, even when I started to learn C, C is a beast for memory leaks, but it would crash the computer. It didn't just crash the program; the whole computer would go, and that's it.
So that machine had 16K of ROM for that was all its program storage, and it had 4K of RAM. Right. So it's kind of remarkable when I think about how much they were able to do in that. I remember at the time working on stuff and thinking, wow, what if we had 60K? You know? It's just like thing numbers that seemed really astounding. When I was in college, I did a design for a computer. It was based on a 68020, which was the latest, greatest thing from Motorola, which I totally loved that processor. It was such a clean, elegant, it had lots of registers. The Z80 was a really nice processor. It was so much nicer than like the 6502, the other stuff that you could get at the time. Like in terms of like having a lot of resources on board to make your job as a programmer easier. But the 68000 series was in its own league, and the 68020 was amazing. And I remember when 256K-bit DRAMs came out, like how excited I was, like, we could put a megabyte in the computer. That would be awesome.
I remember
now, like, you know, the icons on my desktop are a megabyte.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's just crazy. I'm teaching a class on the Unreal Game Engine this fall, and just, you know, if you create basic games, so you start the thing up and you just go like create a basic 3D game, and it's something like, oh gosh, what is it, 85 megabytes or something like that, just, you know, before you've done anything. And it's like, that's just the overhead. And, you know, I go back to those days of thinking like, holy crap, what we used to be able to do on nothing, you know, just nothing.
Or, you know, alternately, what you have available now, what you just, you know, lately I've been doing, I work in Jupyter Lab notebooks, right? Where, you know, I'll run, a local session on my machine, and it's nutty. Like, I wanted to build a Monte Carlo model of this thing that I was working on, and I can just like, let's do 100 million simulations, right? And, you know, let's, you know, drop in you know, it's 2 pages of Python code, Python. I mean, it's got NumPy behind it, which is fast, right? But, you know, I can change a parameter, run another 100 million simulations. 6 seconds. You know, it's just like
well, because I'm using a sklearn library, which is part of NumPy anyway, but I'm doing a nearest neighbors thing, and I was like, gosh, if I have 100,000 data points and I want to run 20 nearest neighbors for all 100,000 points, how long is it? It was 0.2 seconds. I mean, I was like, what in the world are these things? You know, not only are they great algorithms, but damn, are they fast? You know,
I find myself getting tripped up by my experience, because, you know, like the first company I started, we had 8086 computers. Like that was the, you know, what we were building our systems around. And so when we were, you know, we would write in, you know, Turbo C or Turbo Pascal, or the Borland's Turbo C and Turbo Pascal were so amazing. They were just incredible development environments. You could get for like $79 or something. Had an IDE, debugger, everything was in there. They were just really incredible. But you know, we were building stuff that you would burn onto. Remember those UV erasable EEPROMs that was like what you would store programs in to put them in your embedded system or whatever the deal is. And to get reasonable runtimes on these things, like we would work a routine. We would just optimize until, you know, we would get an assembly routine down to like 18 bytes or something, or 25 bytes or something. And I frequently was competing with another guy at the place, so we were to like make the smallest possible. And the thing is, that instinct kind of stuck with me. Like over the next several years, the capability of the machines just exploded. You know, I mean, in no time at all, we actually hit Bill Gates' 640K limit.
Oh, that was like, talk about famous last words when he said no one will ever. But at the time when he said no one will ever need more than 640K of RAM, it seemed reasonable. I mean, that seemed like just, you know, when we're talking about 4K on your computer, it's like, well, of course you'd never need more than 640K.
But optimization was such a big deal. And it was so central to being able to do stuff effectively that I, you know, premature optimization is like my biggest weakness. And is because nowadays you really don't try optimizing it. And this is a thing in machine learning too. Like I'm really terrible about, like, I want to work on some algorithm and I'll get a first draft of it. I'm like, oh God, it's terrible and inefficient. It's wasting all. And I start optimizing it before I even run the first version. And it's always a mistake, you know, because inevitably if you do any optimization, all the bugs will be in your optimization.
Right.
Right. And you didn't need to do it at all. It didn't save you any time. It was, yeah.
But I mean, I think that's actually a reasonable thing this can segue into, for all the younger people who are not reminiscing about their original TRS-80s and stuff, that I think that the one place that optimization is still really critical today is like deep neural networks and machine learning kind of stuff, because you're running so many trillions of calculations that if you can save just 1% off those calculations, you're saving a lot of time ultimately. Or memory. Yeah.
It kind of, but machine learning has this very perverse component to it, which is that if you have bugs, it still works. It just doesn't work as well. Right. And so when you're trying something new, you don't know what level of performance to expect. And so, and this was a thing, I heard the guys at OpenAI at one point talking about how, they developed this reinforcement learning algorithm, PPO, proximal policy optimization. And like, it looks pretty simple on paper. The math, it's like 2 lines of math. It's not a very complicated algorithm, but you get around to implementing it in a way that's reasonably efficient. And, there are plenty of places that you can make a mistake. And the OpenAI guys were talking about how, like, they wrote this algorithm. It was pretty simple. They were using it and the systems were working. And then they'd find a bug. And then, they'd fix the bug and they'd realize they'd had this bug and these big systems they were building, they'd fix the bug and those would perform like way better. And so like years after they had this one, and so that because they sort of understood at some point, like when you do your first cut, make it as simple as possible, because you can't find the way you find the bugs is you read it over and over and over until, if you get lucky, you stumble on a bug, like it actually causes a failure that you can identify as a failure. But that's a pretty perverse aspect of the thing, that you really get punished for trying to do anything complicated on your first pass. And that's one of the things, like, I've really had to force myself to not optimize anything. Make it simple the first time out. Just really, really make it simple, because otherwise you're just in for a world of pain.
Right. I think, and a big shout out to Andre Karpathy, by the way. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch that video yet. I've gotten about 40 minutes into it, fantastic video. He started a new YouTube channel, and he was the former head of director of AI, whatever his title was. But anyway, at Tesla. But he's breaking down this code, and he's basically saying, hey, let's construct this little thing that's going to create better descent gradients, and let's look at it. We can optimize this stuff. And the whole thing that he's doing is 150 lines of code. And that's the thing that's absolutely nutty about neural nets. And I think one of the reasons why it is so hard to find bugs, because as opposed to, if you've got 5,000 lines of code, that's hard to debug and it's hard to go through. But each line kind of does one thing. But neural nets, like, one line of code is doing a whole bunch of crap under the hood, right? It's going through and doing forward propagation, back propagation, adjusting weights, doing all of this kind of stuff. And it becomes really, really, really hard to find, especially, as you say, because it kind of works anyway, right? You may be like, why is the loss function is not getting quite as good as I thought? It seems to be leveling out,
It takes longer to train, and it doesn't get as good results, but it still works. It's a strength of the system, right? That they fail gracefully, incredibly gracefully. Like the tail of failure is just they slowly degrade as you make more and more mistakes. And the flip side of that is why they work for what we want to do in the real world, right?
Right.
Because you start getting into the ballpark and they start getting useful results, and although you can optimize them. In fact, just recently we've seen a whole lot of really interesting work on optimizing neural networks, either doing stuff like distillation and whatnot, where because most of the field right now is still trying to understand the envelope of what's possible, So you do the simple thing, you make it as big as you can, you throw as much data as you can. Then researchers are asking themselves pretty basic questions about where you can get. But but relatively few people, like Tim Detmers, is one of the few people who's really doing research on making the things really efficient and trying to understand the boundaries of that. And, he's finding that we've known for a long time, you don't need a lot of precision, but working at low precision is a hassle because you're constantly having to renormalize everything to stay inside the precision window that you want at all the different, like you only need 8 bits. In fact, you only need like 4.
Right.
I mean, in order to get,
I mean, that's Tesla's that new numbering system. I can't. It's been a while since I did the video.
CFPA,
CFPA. That they basically just created this thing where the mantissa they're constantly adjusting the exponent and throwing away a whole bunch. It's just really genius. But yeah, it is a hassle because
it'll be interesting if Detmers, I haven't gone through his paper yet. It's just out the last couple of days, but it'll be interesting to see how complicated the techniques are because. If they, and of course, he's only doing it at inference, so it's very different for training. Tesla's trying to use it for training. And the having to constantly renormalize, because you want your mantissa to be in the middle of the range, so you're not overflowing on either bound, and you're not underflowing.
Yeah.
And staying in that zone as the weights in the neural network evolve, because they start over this wide sort of Gaussian distribution, and then it consolidates down to some things. But every part of the network has to stay inside that mantissa boundary. So when you're training with restricted resolution, what you're constantly doing is you have something that goes through and looks to see if any of the weights are starting to get out of bounds. And then you have to renormalize each layer, which is, it's a lot of overhead to do. So instead you just train at 32-bit floating point and you can forget all that stuff and it just works, but it's kind of inefficient. Right.
Yeah. And again, it just depends on, what you're talking about. When you're in the lab doing research and just playing around with these things, obviously you give yourself a lot of resolution so you don't have to worry about that stuff. But then obviously for things like what Tesla's doing, when they really, really care about maximum efficiency for training huge data sets, then I think it's worth that trade-off.
Yeah.
But it's a different ballpark.
There's going to be a lot of progress in getting more efficient about training. Up until now, just scaling the computer up. I mean, it sounds weird. You got $1 million computer or a $10 million computer, and I was like, oh, let's just buy 2. It'll be easier than optimizing the code. But the thing is that it really is expensive to do the optimization too. It really, you get the twice as big computer, and you might run 100 jobs on it over the course of the time that you own it, like 100 big jobs. And every single one of them is something you don't have to optimize. If the computer's just twice as big or 10 times as big or whatever. So the economics of it is kind of strange, and optimization is hard. But as people, figure out like formal ways of making the optimization work well, you'll see those adopted, and the hardware requirements for doing this stuff are just going to come down quite substantially. And CFP8 could be a really interesting component of that. I mean, we'll see, but it's promising. I think it certainly gets them. It seems like you can pretty quickly move from BFP16s, which is like the other thing that you can do right now, to CFP8 without a lot of pain. And it's a doubling of everything. It's a doubling of, it's 4 times as much matrix math and twice the bandwidth and half the memory.
Right. Yeah, the bandwidth is a really big deal because you're able to pass things back and forth really, really rapidly. So
they're really, as soon as you have to go off chip right now for these accelerators, it's super painful. I don't know if you watched go
ahead.
P. Bannon, when he was talking about how accessing memory on chip versus accessing memory off chip, it's like 1,000 times slower and 1,000 times, like 1,000, like that's a lot of slowdown.
Right. It goes to show how fast our computers are. But I was going to ask if you keep up with hardware end of things at all. I'm not a hardware expert at all, but it looks like it's like multiply on memory or something like that. There are these chips now that the memory it allows basic functions like add and multiply on the memory itself. Yeah. And that looks like a really impressive potential to speed things up, because if you can do that on the chip, on the memory chip without having to back and forth to a GPU or a neural engine or whatever, that seems like an amazing speed up. And then there's the analog computers that are really cool. They're kind of making a comeback now. And for training, at least for inference, that seems like for like edge computing, once you train these things, those seem like they could be really, really potentially very valuable because they're so low power.
Photonics, I mean, all of these kind of approaches because I mean, this isn't the first. Neural networks aren't the first time, a new promising algorithm came along that our computers were inadequate for. And so you have this, Cambrian, well, not really a Cambrian explosion. There's this explosion of architectural innovation that occurred. So the business I started out of college, we were doing digital signal processing, which was like the digital signal processing revolution was kind of like the neural network revolution in that all of a sudden, digital signal processing, there's all this stuff that we used to have to do in the analog regime because you just couldn't get a computer to do it. And then at some point, the computers were barely fast enough that like you could do multiply accumulates fast enough to keep up with an audio stream. And once you start being able to do that, now, the math is so much cleaner and there's all kinds of really ugly problems that are tough. And so like our business was just basically finding things that people were doing in the analog domain that would be easy in the digital domain and just building that and making a product out of it. But we also had this thing where, doing a million multiplies accumulates per second was like a really big deal at the time. Like if you could do 10,000 or 50,000 or something like that, that was hard. And we were totally silicon limited. So at the time, people were trying that. Oh, maybe if we do it in the memory, ideas were around before.
Cooking. What approximately what year was that you were doing that?
That was 1980. I guess that would have been 85 or 84. Okay.
That's really interesting because I'm, I guess, just a couple years behind you, but I was in college and I was a music minor. So I was a physics major, but a music minor. But like at the time, music, like what we all do now, like you have, Logic or Pro Tools or whatever, but it was overnight renders. I mean, I would render music and people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Because they're, the digital signal processing stuff, it couldn't handle it. And then it couldn't do all the compute that was necessary. So I would like do stuff till 2:00 in the morning, go home and go to sleep, wake up at 7 the next morning, come in and see what the hell I got, So it was a very, very different time.
This story about, another startup I worked at, we were building navigation systems for cars. And so this is actually an electric vehicle company I was working for. One of the ideas at this electric vehicle company was, batteries were a big limitation back in the day. And of course, an idea was, it would be great to have a navigation system in the car that would tell you if you were going to make it, right? And help you find efficient ways to get where you were going. Because at the time, people had, this is a paper maps era. Right. So you go someplace and you're not quite sure where you're going. You drive around a lot trying to figure out the location. Right. I mean, that was a thing people used to do. People with cell phones, I don't remember this, but you used to drive around trying to find the address that you were looking for. You didn't just go right there. And so to try to fix
MapQuest was like a gigantic advancement in the 90s when you could print directions out before you started.
Yeah.
But then inevitably you'd still miss a turn. And then you'd still drive all over the place.
I still have a collection of Thomas guides. So that, Los Angeles is a giant city. And the maps for the city, they came in these binders that were like 100 pages, And so like if you everybody had a Thomas guide. Like if you ever had to go any place that you weren't, and you get so used to your Thomas guide, like you'd know what pages and grid numbers and everything were the different places you frequently went to so you could look it up. But anyway, so we were doing this at the time, the NHTSA did not allow you to have screens in the car. Like that was a total no-no. And we really wanted to have a navigation system as an aid for people who had EVs. So we were looking at how do you make it completely voice interactive? And that's what this startup was. We made a nav system that went in a car and you talked to it and it talked back to you. And we were like using Learn Out and Housebee's. They were the first commercially available speech recognition system. Like it was a really early day stuff. But anyway, so we were working with audio. the only way to get a map data in a car at the time, the only thing that could store enough data to be a useful map in a car was like a CD. CD players were a thing. I mean, they were new, but you could have CD players in the car. There were audio CD players, but we came up with a format where we could write data on an audio CD, and we would modify the entertainment system so that it could read off of these discs, right? And so we got one of the very first CD burners, like back when CD burners were like this fancy rack thing that you would get at a studio or something to, make your promo thing. And it took 24 hours to burn a CD, right? So we would do a map update one, in the lab on our, in these Microsoft network or whatever the deal is. And like, I'd have to copy it across the network to the guy in the next computer over, or put it on a ton of like 3 1/4 inch floppies and carry a stack of them over to his cubicle. And then he'd load them in this thing and he'd start a burn job, and it would take 24 hours to make one disk that we could like take to the car.
Man, that's not particularly scalable at that point.
Well, this is just, I mean, I
guess you could stamp them much more quickly, of course.
For production, you stamp them.
Right.
And we did make stamped discs at one point. Like that company ended up, we took funding from Japanese auto companies. And that was just like where the funding came. And then when things went south in Japan in the 90s, they just cut our funding off, and like our company went from fine to like totally underwater in 2 weeks, and we had to dissolve. Geez.
Oh, that sucks. So were you doing like burning stuff onto the CD that you were then taking into the analog realm because that's the way the CD player was, and then converting it back to digital? Like, was it having to round trip through that?
CDs are digital intrinsically.
Right. But I'm just saying there's a DSP that's in there like right away. So it reads it and it converts it to analog and then amplifies it.
Yeah, we were modifying the CD players. We were probably, there were no CD players that were manufactured in the United States at the time, right? So we had to pay people to translate in the engineering documents and that kind of stuff so that we could figure out how to take. And then one of my first jobs there was like taking apart CD players and like figuring out how they work, hooking them up on the lab bench, figuring out, and then we would build electronics that would like essentially tap the digital signal right after, and we would have to pre-code. We would mix our stuff with the error correction code backwards, so that after it came out of the error correction code, it would be straight digital, and we could anyway. So we were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But the point was, if it wasn't cheap, because you couldn't. We didn't think you could sell a nav system that was $10,000. We were trying to figure out how to make a nav system that was $100. And so it was a great engineering challenge, and I really learned a lot. It was fun. Wow. I mean, it never went anywhere, but it was a great project.
No, it's amazing to think about, like, I guess we're just walking down memory lane here, but to think about how hard it was to do everything. Even I just remember the back of PCs, back in the 80s when they had like 20 different interfaces back there. You never had the right cable, and you were talking about, I remember the first CD I burned was a few years later than that, but it was so difficult to get the data onto the computer that would burn, because 640 or was that right? 650 megabytes, whatever a CD is. It was way more than anything could store. So it was literally like floppy disks. You put it in, read it, go back, copy another one. So you're doing this like swap.
Ethernet was 1 megabit back then.
Yeah.
Right? So just like copying it to the guy, copying it to the cubicle of the guy who had the burner in his cubicle was like, and I would actually do that too. Like we'd do a build on one machine, a map build on one machine, then we'd have to copy it to the machine that had the burner on it. And that was another thing where like you'd get done with the build and you'd tell everybody, okay, nobody do anything on the network. Right? We got to copy this file over there, and I want it to be done today. Right.
It's like everybody go to lunch or something, because it's got to have its own little thing, and nobody can.
Well, we had just recently upgraded from SneakerNet was when you carried the floppies around, right? And so everybody would just have to go back to SneakerNet for 8 hours until we got the file copied across the network.
That's just crazy. Wow. So all right, so let's turn this towards the future instead. I actually had a thought before we started this, and I wanted to. So let's pretend it's October 1st today of 2022. So what are we talking about that was revealed yesterday in the AI Day presentation? I know I'm throwing you right under it right here.
Yeah, I mean, I've said before, it to impress people in the community, pretty simple things. So I watched the chat you did with Farzad and Scott and Walker.
Bradford.
Right.
Yeah.
He said, if it could walk up the stairs and shake Elon's hand, and it's true. You got a robot sitting in the audience, stands up, walks up the thing. If you had a robot that could get in and out of a Cybertruck on its own, not the bed, open the door, climb in the back seat, or climb out, right? Like that's really hard. Those things are incredibly hard to do. Humans are unbelievably dexterous and graceful. We're just incredible. And so we take for granted these just unbelievable things that human beings can do moving around. And so demonstrating any significant amount of that gracefulness or flexibility, I think it would just like blow the minds of people in the space. Right. And I don't expect them to be able to do it because it's really hard. But that was my example of how, something that might seem really simple, picking up a Coke bottle, is, it's
it's really hard. So I guess I just had this vision suddenly when you said that of like, what if in like one of the back seats or something like that in the AI Day presentation, there's a Teslabot with like a big trench coat and a hat on or something. So it's kind of like hiding, and it gets up and takes it off, walks to the front. That would completely blow people's minds.
It would. If you put pants and sneakers and stuff on it and it got up on stage and nobody realized it was a robot until it took the hat off.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah, that would be very impressive. So I'm not like you say, I'm not expecting that to happen this time around, but that'd be cool, because just the fact of being able to sit in a chair and then get out of the chair without just toppling over would be a huge undertaking. And then to be able to walk down the thing, up the stairs, all of those kinds of tasks would be very complicated.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just one of the things that Tesla. I mean, one of the things I'm going to be really interested in myself is to get a sense of what are they focusing on, in the short run. I commented, Tesla Herbert asked me about the picture of the hands, and I kind of laughed at that because like those hands, they don't seem like a serious attempt to make a mass-produced, humanoid. Oh, still there?
Right. Oh no, I'm here. I just wanted to pop this one open. You can see like Tesla AI Day 1. So might as well do that. And then we've got AI Day 2. So yeah, I was like, as long as we got that, I actually had pre-loaded this as a possible thing to look at. But yeah, so for people who might not know, that would be the hands picture that we've got at this point. And
if you look at these, like Scott pointed out, they reduced the number of segments to the digits, right? So they only have two articulation points, right? Like one here and one kind of in the middle. But you can also see that the axis of rotation for each one of them has a pin. So like, how do you generate a significant amount of leverage on that? So you could have a screw feed and a drive and a really short lever arm and whatnot, but your fingers are going to go, it's not exactly going to be, nobody's going to be playing a guitar with that hand, right?
No, not at all. I mean, my personal thought is, assuming this is real, which again, I mean, the one thing I will say is like, again, like that AI Day 1, that was the Dojo chip. So it was a computer render of it, but it was real. Is that this box that's hanging out on the back of the wrist, I think is actually the controller elements for the fingers. So it's all cable based, and which leads to infinite amounts of problems. Though. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe not. But it's also
what Scott was interpreting the two wrist cable things as essentially giving you lateral as well as hinge movement on that joint, which is good because you need actually the trickier one for humans is that the radius and the ulna rotate across each other, right? So like this is amazing. That's 180 degrees. This is nearly 180 degrees, Right. And this angle that you can do like that's like 70, 80 degrees. Like it's the human wrist is an amazing piece of machinery.
And the other thing, of course, is like the fingers have to be if you had human beings with muscles in our fingers, the hand would be too fat. It wouldn't be able to do anything. So
you do have some muscles in your fingers, like these. You can. This is a trick that humans can do, right?
Right.
I mean, humans, the way most people we use our hands, we effectively have 3 fingers. Like we tend to treat the ring finger and the pinky as a pair for most kinds of things that people do. And most people are not very good at articulating them independently either, because you just don't need them. So like 3 fingers is kind of a good upper bound, plus a thumb. An opposable thumb is like that would be a fine hand. But if you really want the full range of things, if to pull the trigger on like if you want to pick up a drill, electric drill, you have to be able to separate your index finger from the other fingers in order to actuate the trigger effectively. And so we do need this degree of freedom if you're going to use those kinds of tools. If you want to be, so now Tesla, they don't have to do all this on day one, right?
No, of course not.
Right. And, I was kind of making fun of how, the hands are made out of steel, right? Like it's not a serious attempt. But on the other hand, it's something that you can go in the machine shop and knock together. So as a prototype, if we're going to build our first version of the robot, it's going to cost $1 million. It's going to be totally hand built, but it'll be an exploratory platform for us to like start developing software and all that kind of stuff. And that they can maybe that's what that is. Right.
You can always cover it with some sort of rubberized, plasticky something or.
Well, I noticed later it does seem to have some polymer material like right at the fingertips or something, so maybe get some grip. But the thing is, once again, using a drill
one more time. Here, I think especially on the thumb you can see it. There's kind of some sort of different coloration on the thumb. So and it wraps around, and that's good because you need that, but you also need it. But the whole palm of your hand needs to be grippy. Yes.
Right. It's not enough to just have some parts of the finger be grippy.
Right.
Yeah. And then another thing is, we don't tend to think about it as much, but the flanges, your fingers actually, they extend all the way down to your wrist through here. And this is just basically webbed together. So you have degrees of like, you can bring the base of your thumb close to the base of your pinky, right? So having a rigid flat palm and just articulating the fingers on the end, it's useful, but it's not like human useful. Like if you don't have an articulated palm in addition to articulated fingers, there are a lot of human tools you won't be able to use very well. Like it'll be hard to chop carrots if you can't articulate your whole palm.
I think I'm remembering, stuff before I was born, but like, when I look at old movies from the 50s about AI, and they're like, look, it plays checkers and it beats a human being like now, like, oh gosh, in 5 years, it's going to be able to walk and talk and do all this stuff. All of the really, really basic things that we don't give any thought to, assuming we're healthy, adults, are incredibly complicated. When you talk about chopping, like folding laundry, chopping a carrot, walking, those things are outrageously complicated things to do. And we just don't give ourselves enough credit. All us human beings are pretty amazing human beings,
biology is nanotechnology, right? I've been thinking about the robot thing for a long time. So for like the last 20, 30 years, like I'll see a bird fly. And this is one of the ones, a sparrow flying around. And I would think, God, how would I build that? What would it take? Right. And there's being able to duplicate the material sophistication of the bird. Like that's one level. And then you get to control, to be able to do this. I was watching this little bird the other day, a really small bird. And I saw it do this trick that I'd never seen before. I'm sure the birds do it all the time, and I just never seen, where like it flew underneath a branch and it landed on the branch upside down, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like it just flew and it inverted and stuck its feet up and grabbed the branch and it landed on the branch. And then because it was like there was something on the underside of the branch, it was interesting. And then it hopped along the branch, like sort of anti-gravity. And the way it would do it is like it would, it would kind of flap its wings to just generate just the right amount of momentum so that it would bop like this. And it was hopping along the underside of the bridge. It was just like, how does that work? How did the bird learn to do it? Think of the controls, I mean,
right.
Animals are incredible. Like biology is amazing stuff. And for most of my life, like I've known eventually there isn't anything that physics permits that we're not eventually going to be able to do. We're going to be able to do all of this stuff, but it's fun to think about what it would take to do that and how long it will take to get there. And now, like with neural networks, I feel like in the last 10 years, a lot of things that seemed really far away are suddenly
right.
Because now, like that bird hopping thing, you could train a neural network to do that. You just could. Like it wouldn't even be hard to train it today. I mean, we know all the basic techniques. You'd have to sit down. It'd be a project. Somebody get a PhD out of it, but you could do it.
Right. Yeah. I like that.
Whereas like 10 years ago, it's like, no, not happening. Never.
Exactly. Well, I think you said when you were interviewing or talking with Tesla Herbert also that it's just shocking. And Andre Karpathy just released a video today of cyberpunk brain dreaming about itself or something, and it was all just it was DALL-E 2 or something like that, but it was just this long sequence that was generated. It was which one?
Stable Diffusion. I think Stable Diffusion. He put it on the back of DALL-E Mini or something. He had it dream of blueberry spaghetti all night long, right? Yeah. There was one with a brain, one with blue, but I mean that's just mind-blowing. Like even today, I look at that and I go, "Wait, that can't possibly be possible." And it's getting there from
2 years ago. 2 years ago, none of this stuff seemed reasonably possible, and now it's happening. So what's another 2 years? It's crazy.
Yeah, and actually, there's a thing that comes up a lot that I kind of want to talk about, which is that. When we think about the robots, when we think about AI, we anthropomorphize them. We think about them in terms of human capabilities, which is what we understand. It's something you can talk to anybody about. But the reality is that's the AI isn't going to follow like a human cognition trajectory, and the robots. I mean, the humanoid robot will be a little bit different because the humanoid robot, you're specifically making it to drop into jobs that the physical human form is a good match for, right? So you're specifically constraining yourself to what humans can do. But most of our AI and most of our tools and a lot of the way that the robot evolves and that kind of stuff, we will choose to develop them in ways that emphasize the strengths and minimize the weaknesses of the robot platform compared to a human platform. Like a robot doesn't have to grow from a single cell, and it doesn't have to self-repair. When it breaks it, we can fix it, right? It doesn't have to extract its nutrients from chemicals in the environment. There's all kinds of ways we can simplify the robot, and we will do that. And the development will be like that too. We will do things. We don't need to design a robot that learns like a baby, that starts as an individual robot with an empty, you can copy it from another machine. And the robot individually, they'll physically vary and they'll need the ability to fine tune themselves. Because I mean, a cool thing about, in manufacturing today, for the most part, if you want to mass produce something, you try to make every single one exactly identical, especially if you're going to run software on it, because if you got any deviations, then the software has to compensate somehow. Right. And smart robots, they could do that. So you could allow your manufacturing tolerances to open up, and that lets you do things that, like, the wrist joint can age over time. Or, the robot could have an injury and it could keep working. Like if some joint doesn't work, like it'd be smart enough to adapt its motion to deal with some inconvenience that it's suffering in the short run. Right.
Wow. So, all right. So let me ask this. Which is the bigger challenge at this point? Is it the software challenge or the hardware challenge? For software, okay.
the hardware has kind of two different challenges. One is building a robot at all at any price. And then there's building mass producing the robot,
right?
Making something that can do what a human does and cost $10,000 to make, right?
Right.
Like as far as I can tell, that's completely possible. You probably need to get like the 100 million a year run rate. I mean, you need to build a lot of them to get to that capability. And to get to that, there's a lot of really fundamental engineering that has to be done. I mentioned this, like, I think the actuators are hard. Like, the ideal actuator for robot is not something you can buy off the shelf today. You'd want to develop those from scratch. And that's a major undertaking. Like, it's a much bigger undertaking to design those than, because Tesla's car, the motors they put in their cars are amazing. Like, they're incredibly more performant than anything you could have got off the shelf prior to when they did this, because they've really done a lot of work to make those motors better. And yet, the robot actuator thing, it's going to be 10 or 100 times more work than that to do. And you're going to need like 20 different or 50 different actuators.
Right.
Robot.
Yeah.
But
and of course, like, you're dealing with, moving from something like yay big to, so obviously different challenges.
In some ways that's good.
Yeah.
In some ways it's bad. Like, I was trying to figure out, like, how small and operate, because one of the things about electromagnetic actuators, right, is if you have a magnetic field spanning a gap and you're using forces across that gap to generate your torque or whatnot, you want the gap to be really small, because the permittivity of air is like 10,000 times lower than like metal. My CO2 meter says I'm entering the dumb zone.
I left mine upstairs today, so there you go.
I started doing this so that I could tell when I was going to start getting stupid, because there's not enough ventilation in there.
Right. Yeah,
and apparently we just crossed that threshold.
So if the conversation suddenly it tanks, we know why. But you're saying, like, so the air gap is like,
how small can you get the gap? Like, because in principle, you have to deal. There's expansion and that kind of stuff.
Right.
The problem that the carbon rotor. Oh, I saw you've got one of the. Have one of those laminates.
Yep.
You see it?
Yeah, I saw yours too. I like that yours is red. It blends it's very cool. It blends in with the wall.
It's picture was maybe not the best color choice, but anyway, so the thing that the carbon fiber does in that, which is basically allow them to go to higher rotational velocities and still, but with a robot actuator, could you get down to a micron? Okay, now if you got down to a micron, how do you make that? Like, how do you hold the tolerance? How do you assemble it when your air gap is a micron, for a really small motor? Physics lets us do it, and it's the right thing to do. And maybe you fill the gap with a fluid instead of using an air gap, right? And there are lots of interesting solutions that you could try. But that, it's like nobody does that today. That's a level of actuator engineering that just like nobody's ever had to do. And we will want to do that, because when you're building robots in really large volumes, which we'll make them in fantastic volumes. It'll be worth solving that problem.
Right. The other thing about it is that, as opposed to like motors for cars where you want this thing to be able to rotate very, very rapidly, these are, I was interesting when you were talking, because the gearing thing, I hadn't really thought about that, but motors are really good when they can spin fast and you gear them down and move things slowly, but that's not what you want. You don't need a gearing system inside of a shoulder to move things around.
Gearboxes are motors.
Yeah. So, you need a motor that's designed to rotate very, very slowly, ultimately, because this is a really slow,
you want a lot of
motor
torque.
rotating it. Yeah. A lot of torque and very slow. Yeah.
And if you go look for there are like these industrial, like rotating table type or like piezo actuated. There are all different kinds of actuators that look at this space. But they're all things that sell in really small volume, and they're really expensive. And they wouldn't be good for this. They're too big. because they're made in small volumes. But like I was looking at, well, could you use like chemical vapor deposition to lay down a laminate, and there's because we can get to really small scales if we want to. We can, if you spend the money and you have the time, it's like in a lot of ways we make silicon chips that are more sophisticated than living creatures are now. Oh, yeah. And at 50 billion transistors on, 50 billion perfectly a chip that's got 50 billion transistors on it, every one of those transistors is freaking within its digital envelope. It's perfect, right? They're perfectly. So biological systems have to deal with extremely high error rates. So the designs have to be really redundant, and that costs you a lot of inefficiency. But you can have like this flawless crystalline, integrated circuit, which has features all the way down to like sub 10 nanometer, 5 nanometer feature sizes. Like, and we talk about 50 billion transistors. Each of those transistors is composed of many parts. It's not like 50 billion parts. It's like, a trillion parts. There's a trillion parts. In the chip, in your iPhone.
Yeah, it's like this guy right here.
So like when we want to, like human beings can make amazing stuff. And with the robots, we will, but it'll take a while. We won't see that. Like, I don't think we'll see the really good actuators in 10 years. So anyway, getting back to the whole question, is the body hard? Is the software hard? The software is hard. We're going to be working on the software probably longer than we're going to be working on the hardware. But, this just like the hardware, you can start with relatively simple. You just have to get over the threshold of it being useful enough to be worth building a bunch of them. And now you've jump-started your market. Now you have the revenue stream to pay to make the software better and to make the hardware better. And they'll get click, 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 click. They'll both get dramatically better. And at some point, we'll have robots. They have bodies better than ours, right?
Right.
Finer precision.
Certainly they'll have the ability to, like, if you have a bum arm, you just unscrew it and put a new one on. So that's a huge advantage they have over humans. So interesting.
Do you get to the point where like it would be worth to like moving your brain over?
Right. I unfortunately feel like I'm a generation too old for that, but I do feel like that's a reasonable possibility at some point in the future that people will be able to move their brains over. So So let's turn to the software. So hardware, yes, actuators. I don't think any of the materials like building the structure is not going to be that complex, right? I mean, aluminum, plastic, nothing crazy. The actuators will be the hardest
printing ideas.
Yeah, I love the idea of 3D printing these guys, at least in the initial stages when they're figuring out how to do it. Of course, eventually it'll be like, just die cast these suckers and pop them off. So,
the casting.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even need a gigacast. It could be a microcast. It's like a little teeny thing that just makes an arm.
Instead of making your car the same way they make Hot Wheels, we make robots the way we used to make G.I. Joe.
Exactly. Right. There you go. It's just shoot them off. So what is it going to be? What's the biggest challenge with software? Because in some ways, I feel like Tesla's got a huge leg up. Well, I mean, obviously they do because they've been working on full self-driving and factory vision systems for at least a decade now. But what's still like outstanding problems that are going to have to be overcome for this robot to actually be useful?
Yeah, there's a lot. Actually, the threshold of utility might be really low. I loved Scott's feeding the robots, feeding the robots in the zoo or whatever sort of example, because it is like that's a great example. I don't know factory automation nearly as well as he does, but walking through a factory, I can see there's all kinds of relatively simple jobs that some person probably has to do, and that you could drop a robot into, and so if you get the threshold where based on vision, it can pick, an arbitrarily shaped, part from in an arbitrary position out of a box of parts, and walk someplace and deliver it, place it in a fixture to feed, that. Now that's not simple. That's still an unsolved problem in many respects, but it's useful. And that's something you could get to in the next couple of years.
Right.
That and it kind of seems like a good place to start. I mean, I like the analysis that leads to like that being like I've described materials handling as the really basic thing, just moving boxes and stuff around. I mean, that's a level of utility also. And it might be even simpler because maybe you can build the boxes with handles or whatnot. You can simplify the job for the robot to start out.
Right.
But the arbitrary pick and place and just locomotion. Like if you can clear those two, you've got use. And assuming the robot doesn't cost $10 million,
right?
Like if you can make it for $100K and it can do that, like that's a moneymaker for you. You can already make your money back on that, and then it only gets better from there, right? Because the same robot. If you start with a robot body that's relatively general, and this is the thing I find kind of disappointing about seeing a metal hand, because my hope would be that Tesla would be ambitious enough for the first thing that they manufacture in significant amount of utility to already be working on, like, how do we let's go for something that's mass producible, right? Let's do a design that maybe it's not mass producible right now, but there's a runway to get to where you can build it in large volume and it has the precision that you need at the cost point that you want. And, it's repairable, this has all the characteristics that you want on this thing. And to me, like a bunch of billet milled aluminum parts with, precision joints and that kind of stuff doesn't really get you there.
Interesting. Because I just kind of thought like, wow, it was like aluminum's nice and easy to mess with. You can change the shape of it easily enough. So I guess I was thinking that it would actually make it easier. But so what would your material of choice would be? Something like plastic or something that is even more malleable? Okay.
You have to look at the performance envelope you eventually want to get to physically for the robot. So what strength to weight ratio does it have to have? Are there any like weird thermal things? If you're going to want to water cool it, things get complicated. Like, I don't think you need to water cool it. I wouldn't. Right. I'd want it to be air cooled and whatnot. And so, so that, that there's the question of heat sinks and that kind of stuff. If you're going to do air cooling, and you can't do those in plastic, there's some things that you have to use metal for. Right. And then EMI shielding, but you can do metal impregnated plastics for that. But for the volume that you want, because the human body is a certain size, for the volume of the parts that you can tolerate and the weight that you want and the strength that you want, plastic is really good material, I think, for that kind of stuff. Now, if you need to do something precise in the short run, like you need, if you need to build something it's a foot long and it has 10 micron or 100 micron tolerances at the two ends, well, that's hard to do in plastic right now, right? You can do it in a good plastic, but you have to like build a mold. It's complicated. It's a lot easier doing that with 3D printed plastic is hard, but milling that out of a piece of aluminum is really easy right now. Right. So for some kinds of things, the aluminum, metal wins. And for quick and dirty prototyping where you're like buying all your joint hardware off the shelf, metal is just totally going to win for that kind of stuff. But it'd be cool to see them move to plastic sooner rather than later, because I think plastic is what most of it's going to be down the road.
Yeah. Okay. So except for maybe like the middle area that's got to contain like the computer and the battery, which is very heavy. So that's might need a little bit more of a structural shell around it. But most of everything else you think could be plastic. That's interesting.
I don't think there's for thermal and electromagnetic reasons, there are things you want to make out of metal. The plastic is, the weight of if the torso weighs, 30 kilos or 50 kilos or something that, human scale, then you can use plastic for the legs. Another question is deformation under load, right? So on industrial robots, plastic is bad because industrial robots, they have to be able to deal with load variations of like 50 kilograms and have 10 microns of deviation in their positioning. So you look at industrial robots, they're unbelievably stiff. They look like they're made out of drilling pipe. They're just huge. But the thing about neural networks, right, is, you can make the robot out of rubber and a neural network could still learn to walk it around, right? You can have really large dimensional deviations and it'll be okay. So plastic should be great for that too.
Right. And I think that's like, I understand what you're saying, but in case anybody in the audience isn't, like, the basic compensation thing here is that a good vision system allows a huge amount of variability in the environment. And that, I think, is like the sort of secret sauce, I guess, for Tesla for this thing. Because what they've got is so the robots, the industrial robots, they like go to a spot, they pick something up. If it's not exactly where they expect it to be within a very small tolerance,
I like
they just miss.
You said it's blind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great way to think of it. Like, you put a blindfold on a human worker in a factory. Now, what kind of constraints do you have? Well, all of a sudden, everything needs to be in the right place.
Yeah, and also they're probably going to injure themselves. But but yeah, exactly. So it's like the vision system allows you to do things like have the fingers have a little bit of play if they are using a cabling system as opposed to actuators directly in there. So because you can actually visualize where the fingers are, and you can also also see where the factory is. You can see if you're walking on non-level ground or an oil slick or things like that, and compensate, as opposed to a blind robot that would just go, banana peel kind of thing. So
it's proprioception also. So if you're a weakness of conventional control, right? If you're using like PID algorithms and that kind of stuff to do control, you can't have 300 possibly nonlinear sensors all feeding into this algorithm. Like, it's impossible to write. But with a neural network, like, your inputs, they can be nonlinear, they can be variable, they can be noisy, and they can, the space of, the input space can be really complicated. Like, because if you can deal with vision, you can deal with 100 proprioceptive, position sensors that are maybe sloppy and maybe temperature dependent and maybe susceptible to EM noise. And like, you can have all of these flaws to it. And then you just train the neural network in that environment, and it learns to compensate for all of this stuff. So, I can stick speaking of like really interesting intelligence tricks, right? Put a bunch of coins in your pocket. You can stick your hand in your pocket and you can count how much change you got, right? You can tell a quarter. You can tell the head of a quarter from the bottom of a quarter. You can tell the pennies. You can tell pennies from nickels, not just by their size, but by their thermal conductivity. Like, once again, the human hand is pretty amazing with the sensitivity, but all of that is touch feedback and force feedback types of things, right? And the robot gets all this stuff too. In fact, if the neural network does the motor controllers too, the back EMF from the motors gives you torque feedback. Right. From every single motor, right? So the more actuators you have, the more pieces of feedback that you get. And you can, of course, you can have some load cells in some parts of the body and that kind of stuff. And so all of that feedback makes it so that a robot can reach around behind it and grab a power drill, even if it can't see it, right? Because it can do the same trick the game can do. Like it can convert what it's feeling into an understanding of what it's handling. Right.
But of course, a robot, probably these guys are going to have the advantage of being able to see out the back of their heads.
Yeah, so. Yeah, they might have cameras on their wrists, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's
put eyes in their elbows.
Yeah, like wherever you need them. Yeah. So yeah, that's. It is an interesting thing, because one of the issues with, of course, with full self-driving, they stripped it out, was, not LiDAR at the beginning with Tesla, but then getting rid of radar and reducing down to only one input stream. So proprioception is, interestingly enough, like that kind of feedback is other data. But then again, of course, Teslas also have IMUs inside them. So they are getting other, they know what the G loads are, side to side, backwards and forwards, things like that. So they are still getting multiple streams of data too. So I guess the proprioception, as long as it's not, the one good thing about robots is they're relatively slow. If it gets confused, it's not doing 75 miles an hour on the highway. So it can take a second and kind of go like, oh, what's going on? Oh, that's what's happening. My proprioception is off a little bit, right? So it can pause for a second if it needs to, whereas a car, not a good idea. you know.
Yeah.
So the car, if it takes a moment where it has to think about it, that's a really bad thing. So
yeah, it's a critical real-time activity, driving a car.
Right.
And I mean, the problem an interesting thought experiment is you say, well, if I could if FSD only drove 10 miles an hour, right? Let's just dumb it all the way down. Is it perfect at 10 miles an hour? And I think try it. I've done it where I'm driving down the suburban neighborhood and I just set the speed to 15 miles an hour. I'm like, is it perfect now? And it's not. It still makes all kinds of mistakes. So there are things you can't compensate for just by taking your time. But and the robot will have those limitations too. There are things that not moving slower doesn't solve all problems, but it solves a bunch of them. Right.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not as time critical, because if it has to take a pause for a minute, if a robot if it gets confused and just stops walking, I guess aside from somebody bumping into it from behind or something, no big deal. Right? Again, a car is a much more mission critical task. If it stops or swerves off the road or slams the brakes on, those are bad. Those are bad environmental things that can cause serious problems.
If you want your robot to walk down a busy sidewalk in Manhattan surrounded by other human beings, now it's more like the car problem.
Yeah, that becomes and also, people will bump into it and stuff, which a car doesn't generally have to deal with. So, so it's it's rather impressive how much stuff. So you talked and you've mentioned about the future for like Teslabot and being able to walk around in the woods or go to the beach with the family or be in these crazy environments. But I think it's pretty clear that what we're going to be starting with is baby steps, and it's a factory, which is a pretty contained environment. The lighting is generally the same, more or less. So again, the variability that you have in driving, where the sun can be shining straight into the car and it could be raining on top of you and you've got sun, right? Weird stuff can happen.
There are ways the robot is easier.
Yeah,
there are things about the robot that are easier than the car. There's such a long arc to this, and we're so at the beginning. And we're going to get 10x better, and then it'll get 10x better, and then it'll get 10x better again. And at some point, they'll be absurdly superhuman. But when you talk about what they're going to do, you kind of have to specify the time frame that you're talking about, because what they can do in 2 years is going to be so different than what they can do in 10. And then 10 years later, they're going to be even more dramatically capable than that. So I do think it's one of the topics that came up on that, the chat you did on the panel discussion on Farzad's channel a couple of days ago. You were talking about how does this affect people's desire to have kids? And it's funny, I heard that question come up, and my thinking was totally the opposite of the impulse. I was like, how much easier would it be to have kids if you had a robot babysitter? Right? I mean, and not like the clunky, first generation one, but the robot babysitter that you can get 20 years from now, right? Where, because the bar is so high for raising kids these days. It's so labor intense. I mean, when I was a kid, in the morning, they just cut you loose and you come home for dinner, and that was child raising. You went out and explored, broken buildings and got in trouble with the kids down the street and that kind of stuff. And it was all okay. But now people's expectation is that raising kids is a lot more labor intensive. People are much more concerned about the risks to children. And how great would it be for a kid to have some, to be the focus of attention of something that can help it at all times. It will keep it safe no matter what the situation is. So you can be confident that the kid is okay, right? You can spend as much time with your child. And if you can't spend time with your child, you don't have to feel like they're getting neglected, right? Like
that is a thing. I mean, one of the human rearing things is, and I've still got a 14-year-old at home, is a 15, actually just turned 15. But kids demand attention, and they're like, go do this with me, go do this. And you're like, oh, I'm busy, or I'm tired, or I had a rough day at work, or I got to cook dinner. You're right. I mean, what if you have this robot that's just always
Rosie, the robot?
Yeah, but it's always like, sure, I'll go out and play football with you right now, no problem, because I'm available for you. That's my job. And 2 o'clock in the morning, kid wakes up with a nightmare, the robot's there to comfort them. it would create a very, very different environment for children.
It's going to be, it's going to be weird for a while. Right. I think, in the short run, we're going to think of robots as like, in the short run, robots and AI are sort of these clunky approximations to people.
Right.
But, at some point they become like our idealized, and we will make them, an idealized version of what we are. They're not selfish. They don't get bored. They're always kind. They always listen when you need to talk. They're infinitely patient. There's so many traits that are hard for human beings to consistently have unless you're some kind of saint, right? Like the robots will just have that. And will just be part of the way we build them.
That actually ties into something you were talking about with a police force. And I guess everybody kind of has in their mind like, RoboCop or Terminator or something scary, but the opposite could very well be true, is that if you make these things nice and they have nice smiley faces,
greatest cops in the world.
Yeah, they're infinitely patient and they don't have to really worry about themselves. Like one thing about a police officer, of course, is it's very dangerous. Like what if this guy what if this guy draws a gun? I might like die. So and a robot cannot worry about that because an individual robot's not really worth that much. So
they don't get impatient trying to resolve a problem. I mean, even a police officer, he's not going to spend 8 hours trying to deal with a problem. But the robot, if it takes 8 hours, it takes 8 hours. You spend all the time that you need to do that kind of stuff. The other, you can have a lot of them. And, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, they're a great touchstone here, right? If your priority is, keep people safe, do what people tell you to do. And, the third one down there is like, don't let yourself get trashed if you can avoid it, right? Like after those other things, but like, how great would it be? Like if we could have human police officers that had those characteristics, I think everybody would think those were great. So, being able to build, and they only, they're incapable of hurting somebody simply, by the way that the software gets designed. I mean, of course, the great fear is that, and the reason that Elon talks about wanting to make the robot, slow and weak and very non-threatening and all that kind of stuff is that, nobody will be afraid that even if the software goes rogue or even if some bad actor takes, control of them, that it won't present a threat to people. But I think we'll get over that. That we won't. I don't know. It's look at the cars people drive. Right, they're not safe cars.
No,
right? We got used to cars. They're just part of the background now, and people recklessly drive 3,000-pound death machines recklessly. 10 feet from your kid while your kid's walking to school every morning, and we just like shrug it off.
Right. Yeah, and interestingly enough, they have become safer over time, of course, because a car from when we were kids is like, whoo, it's like you're lucky if you had a seatbelt. So,
the cars haven't gotten safer in the sense that just now they're getting better at saving people from themselves as drivers. But if you live in an urban environment. Like I came to LA 30 something years ago, and I came here from the boonies, and I thought drivers were crazy, right? When I came here, like it is, whoa, you're pretty far from Kansas now, and it's just gotten like it's incomparably worse. I don't know if good bad is a thing, but the patience of people has gone down, and the level of frustration that they quickly get to, like how fast people drive and how close the degree of negative margin with which they operate vehicles has just seemed to like go up and up year after year. So I feel like cars aren't really saving us from ourselves. They're still allowing us to be really, sort of stupid on the road, and maybe FSD will and those kinds of things.
You've got the same kind of thing going on here with the robot. If you put its brain in a car, it can be infinitely patient. I think about that a lot. If somebody cuts me off and I get really emotionally upset about it, I'm like, the FSD computer is not going to do that. It's going to be like, that's cool, whatever. It's chill.
I'll set my car to drive the speed limit. when I drive around town. And like I drive faster than the speed limit when I do that. Everybody drives fast than the speed limit, but I'll let the car do it. And if the guy behind me is tailgating me, my car doesn't care. It's fine. It's not feeling any pressure at all to accommodate the whims of this fellow in this SUV behind me, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's an important aspect of safety, honestly, is that, again, we're kind of our own worst enemies in a lot of cases like that, because becoming emotionally involved in a situation is exactly the kind of things that leads people to do stupid stuff on the road and potentially take your eye off the ball for a second and crash or whatever. So, so fortunately,
and like robots do that for all the other aspects of our lives potentially. It's an interesting thing. Like, think about human societies. We've got a distribution of people. We have people who are kind. We have people who are aggressive. We have people who are slow, people who move fast, people who are in a hurry, people who want to take their time. There's just a distribution on all these different things. But you don't have to, like, what percentage of these perfect citizen robots would you have to add to the mix before the dynamics of the whole thing would change? And how will people respond? Like, will people respond by becoming worse, or will people be embarrassed at how childish they are compared to their robots, right? and shape up? It'll be interesting when they're part of our society, right?
Yeah, I was thinking, someday when our AI overlords have taken over and stuff, it's an interesting thing to think about. Will they enforce it? Will they say, "Oh, let humans be humans"? It's that Olde died. It's like, oh, they're just going to be aggressive and do stupid stuff, and as long as they don't do anything too crazy, don't worry about it. Or are they eventually going to say, like, no, you guys are dangerous. You need to calm all this stuff down. Here's some pills. Take some pills and calm down. So all of us may eventually just be like really chill. Oh man. So we've got but I mean, in the meantime, of course, the robots, like as you're saying, at the start of it is very much they're clunky. They're going to barely be able to do standing and sitting tasks. And,
they don't care about their social status. Which is that's an issue for human. We want things to be fair, right? And where everyone is insecure about their place in society, and we're always keeping an eye out to not be. And robots don't care about that kind of stuff.
Interesting. So I know I've kept you for a long time, but I actually want to touch on 10.69 before we go, because I'm sort of curious. Sorry. Elon has been really, really promoting this one, and now we're only 3 days away from supposed release of that. Right. We'll see if it actually shows up on the 20th. But what do you think it's going to be worth the wait? Is it going to be that big of an improvement? What I mean, I know we saw the 10.13 release notes. Yeah, I am too. Honestly, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I mean, they've been getting farther and farther apart, and I personally, I mean, there's definitely a component, which I suggested a long time ago, that the more people they add to the program, the more you raise the bar of not wanting it to do stupid things. That it needs to be more idiot proof, as we're all idiots, right? We need to be protected from FSD. The more and more of us that are using it, so that's a component, I think, for sure. But I think that another significant component is, they've been talking about adding more planning associated or pre-planning components to the neural network. So, for instance, the intersection thing was basically using a neural network to basically identify the characteristics of an intersection when you're at it. That's hard. That's a hard thing to do. And Andre said they were using transformers or GPTs, right? Yeah. Using GPTs to do these kinds of things. And Elon implied the same thing, that they're using transformers to do these kinds of things, which is great. I think it's a fine tool for this kind of stuff. I wish I had a good sense of, there's no literature in academia. I can't look at well, how big a neural network do you need to do that? What's the resolution of the input and whatnot? But
the one thing I will say about transformers, and I actually did a deep dive into it because for my company, I'm working on some stuff with transformers now, but the huge advantage that they have is that RNNs, LSTMs, CNNs, you feed them data and they eventually just top out and they just don't get better. So, the difference between 10 million and 20 million data points or something doesn't improve it that much. Transformers are really slow to start, but as far as we can tell so far, the progress is linear. Or more or less, you just keep adding more data and it gets better and better and better. And that's the part that really impresses me about them using transformers and GPT type,
So the characteristic that you identify, it's a very real aspect of using transformers today because of the way that we use transformers and the way that we build transformers. We build transformers as very high capacity models in general. Attention itself adds a lot of capacity to a model, and the thing is that when we used to build LSTMs, we made them really small,
right?
Compared, like the capacity that we were building into LSTMs. So you're much more likely to start bumping up against the limits of something there. Like in general, if you were to make, LSTMs have this problem with duration, right? You get the sort of vanishing gradient problem when you have to back propagate through a long string of time, a long time sequence. But if you're willing to put up with that, they seem to follow the same sort of improvement curve associated with size if you're willing to go down that. So I would say that characteristic is it's not a fundamental weakness of, say, LSTMs or something like that. Okay. But the way that we do use transformers and the way we do build transformers, you're much less likely to bump into those for smaller problems. And even, we build really, really big transformers for really big language models. Right. Like they're just like 176 billion parameters is a lot of parameters.
It's 1 trillion for the next one, right? Something crazy like that.
That's
what I heard.
I wonder how some of that right now is, we know they scale, and let's just keep pushing the scale and see if there's a wall, right? And see if it would. Another interesting thing that Tim Detmers had in the paper that he just came out with was he was talking about how there are, as you go to these bigger models, there are like these phase changes that you undergo in what the parameters are getting used to do, and so it's going to be interesting to look at that. But an interesting aspect of that is that there's a chance that when you get to some scales, like once you've used a certain scale to train up to, you'll be able to distill down and remove a large, in other words, it might be that the number of parameters that you need to train with a particular kind of data computational profile to get to a particular result, that might not be representative of the parameters that you actually need to run the model. It might be that once you get to the end of this, that you can trim out a large fraction of all that stuff and then build on that model or turn it into a component of other stuff there's just, we're so at the beginning of this.
I think that's the other thing is that people, maybe it's an impatience thing. I don't know, but everyone's like, oh, how come we haven't done this yesterday? And it's like, we're so AlexNet came about in 2012. We're talking about literally 10 years ago.
Not even.
Since the modern,
10 years in December.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, we're talking 10 years since the modern neural network came into existence. Now, obviously, neural nets have been around since the 50s, the original multi-layer perceptrons and stuff. But this new iteration is such a baby. And so at the same time, it's like on one hand, it's like, how the hell did they do this? And how does it keep getting better at this speed? And on the other one, like, how come it can't do full self-driving and we don't have full robots yet? So there's this weird sort of tension.
We don't have a good human beings. It's hard to have a good sense of how complicated the world is,
right?
Because we're so well adapted to the world that we inhabit. A lot of things that are actually pretty simple seem just inconceivably hard to a human being. There's this. I was just thinking about the way animals vary, and so human beings, our working memory is actually really small. It's like famously 5 or 7 objects that we can hold in our working memory. And that you can measure this different ways. But, there's a common measure of working memory that if you apply to the chimpanzees, they have like 5 times the working memory of a human being, right? So there's this interesting, there's this chimpanzee researcher. He built this kind of a video game, right?
Right.
And what you get is you see a screen for like 200 milliseconds, a blink or something, and it just has a bunch of digits, 1 through whatever, however many there are on the screen, right? And then they all get replaced with just boxes. And the game is you have to tap them in the order from 1 to whatever.
Wow.
Right. So how many can you do? Right. So human beings can do 5 or 7 really easily, but you get to 10 and people just like can't do it. And 15 is just like right out there. You just
right.
Chimpanzees, they do 25, 30, 40, right?
Really?
Same time frame.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, there's an interesting theory that why humans have bigger brains. And in general, in lots of really simple metrics where we should substantially outperform chimpanzees, but on these kinds of metrics, they actually outperform us pretty significantly. But humans have a sequence memory, which is a profound sequence memory. You can memorize Homer's Iliad, right?
Right.
For big chunks of history was people memorizing thousands and thousands of pages of stuff, and that was how. History was oral. You literally transmitted it by reciting it to people. And you hear a song 4 or 5 times and you can't unhear it, right? Like for the rest of your life, those lyrics will be playing through your head every time you hear 4 bars on the, the cafe radio system. So humans have the sequence memory, which is really profound. And there's this interesting theory that sequence memory is really useful for language. And so when humans started developing language, in our evolution, we gave up the working memory in order to get the sequence memory to enable language capabilities. Anyway, so this is kind of an example of how human beings aren't actually very general in terms of our intelligence. There are other animals that way outperform us in lots of ways, and machines don't have any of these limitations. They have as much working memory as we can pack in the box. They have as much sequence memory as we can pack in the box, right? I mean, the envelope of what, and you can do the trade-offs for any particular task, right? You can load a different neural network to do the other task with a different trade-off between.
And the other thing about it is even with resolution issues and variability, their memory and their effective ability to replicate the same pattern over and over again is much more perfect than ours. We have degradation. Again, it's like you try to remember too many things, or I memorized poems in high school and I can still remember parts of them, but I can't remember the whole thing. So, my sequence memory has, even though I memorized this thing, it's I kind of remember it now. So, I remember the first few lines. So my sequence memory has degraded, whereas a computer doesn't have to have that limitation. So once it learns something, it can always know that. It's not like it has to relearn it again. The interconnects in the human brain, they have a homeostatic equilibrium that they occupy. Did you know, I read this really interesting theory recently that the reason people dream is to preserve the function of your visual cortex during the period of time that you're sleeping. Do you know, have you heard this one? No, I haven't.
So this is really interesting. So I hadn't known this. Apparently, there's a lot of interesting research on the last year. So the functions in your brain that are operating, they fight for neurons. That is, your brain has a neuron budget. And so, if you have 2 adjacent regions in your brain and you use one of them more than the other, the one that you're using more, it gets priority on the neurons. So it'll start stealing neurons from the adjacent function. So the adjacent function will gradually degrade. It will have fewer and fewer neurons because it'll be giving them up to the competing thing. And apparently, this competition is really fierce, right? Wow. And they
fast
can do,
too. I mean, if we're talking about 8 hours or something, it's
apparently in just a couple of hours, you can see changes. So they can.
Wow.
I'm going to get the numbers a little bit wrong on this stuff, but you can have a human being get in an fMRI machine, right, and close their eyes, and you can watch the visual cortex start to degrade while they're awake. So here's the thing: when you dream, your visual cortex gets activated.
Right.
So you're dreaming, you're using that. So there's this theory. It's an interesting theory that a part of the reason we dream in pictures is to save our visual cortex from getting cannibalized by other functions in your brain, which are operative when you're sleeping. Okay, so anyway.
Yeah, it makes you realize, ultimately we're just a whole collection of things fighting for themselves. Like all the little cells, everything's like, gimme. So,
well, that the shape of your bones, they exist in a dynamic equilibrium. There's a kind of cell, an osteoblast, that makes bone continuously, and there's osteoclasts that break down bone continuously. And the osteoblasts, they're sensitive to electric fields, and your bone is a piezoelectric crystal, right? So when your bone flexes, the places it flexes the most, you get the most electric field, and the bone density automatically goes up in that area. And the osteoclasts, they're just like an acid, which is constantly dissolving your bone. Right. So this is why, like, if you sit in bed, if you're stuck in bed for a really long time, your bones gradually dissolve away because your osteoblasts aren't doing anything, but the osteoclasts are still dissolving the bone away. And so your bone is this dynamic thing that, like, it automatically adapts to what you do. The way what you do will, your bone will dynamic. And, most of the systems in your body are like that. Your ligaments, your tendons, your muscles, they're all dynamic. They respond to how they're being used, and they grow, or their properties change. The chemical composition of your blood changes too. And so it's no big surprise that of all the tissue in your body, your brain is the most metabolically active tissue, and it's the fiercest fighting ground for those resources. So anyway, think of your memories in that context, right? Like, if you're not using it, you're going to lose it, right? Because the clock is ticking, and another part of your brain wants those neurons. Except for still have very mental lyrics. So
that's what I was going to say. It's all the useless stuff that's still stuck in there that's annoying as hell.
So here's the thing about language, right? You learn language early. You keep learning it. Right. I learned a lot about learning language when I taught myself Japanese. And an interesting thing is that you keep learning language your whole life. Like you like, one simple metric is just like, how many words do you know? Like, you can do these tests to sort of figure out sort of roughly what your functional vocabulary is. And the functional vocabulary of a human being, it grows throughout your life. Like, your average 60-year-old knows more words than your average 50-year-old does. And the rate of increase of functional vocabulary is approximately linear up to the point of time that senile dementia kicks in. Right. So right up until senile dementia, your vocabulary is getting bigger and bigger, and your ability to use language effectively just grows and grows and grows throughout your life. So how is it that you hang on to those resources throughout your life in this space where the brain is this incredibly dynamic, war ground where all these different functions are fighting each other for resources? Why is it that that A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that little thing that you learned like when you were 2, and you still know it perfectly? Yeah, right. There's stuff you haven't thought about in 10 years that you'll still, if it's a sequence.
Oh yeah. So, well, I mean, even beyond that,
special treatment for human beings, like it's our superpower.
Yeah. But it's even beyond that. I mean, there's stuff that's still hidden back there, because like sometimes you'll smell something you haven't smelled since you were a kid. Like maybe your mom wore a certain perfume or something, and 20 years later you smell it, you're like, whoa, So it's just amazing how there's weird stuff back there waiting to be triggered. Still.
Smell is different, right? Smell is the only sense you have that doesn't go directly into your cerebral cortex. It goes into the older parts of your brain, and then it gets to your cerebral cortex after filtering through the older parts of your brain. So there is this theory that smell is more directly linked to memory, because it's literally more linked to memory. Like, it's a more direct connection.
That would explain things then. So yeah. Wow. Fascinating stuff. I guess we've answered the question that Philip K. Dick asked then, because androids won't dream of electric sheep because they don't need to dream, because we can keep them from competing over the neurons in there. So
it's, Andre's A100 dreams of blueberry spaghetti.
That's true.
Maybe he'll do an electric sheep one, and then we can see.
Oh, now we should definitely do that. That would be great. What a
make a pun out of this. Did Andre dream of electric sheep?
We could ask, maybe we should ask Dolly if it dreams of electric sheep. Maybe it would give us an answer and tell us. Wow. All right. Well, I have kept you for a long time, and I really appreciate your generosity. And I don't know, I learned a bunch of stuff. I had no idea about primates having, monkeys having better working memory than us humans. So I feel humbled today.
In a certain sense. I mean, working memory is actually different from that sort of quick perception memory. But yeah, so apparently a chimpanzee can glance at a scene and close his eyes and remember the scene really well, like where all the objects in the scene were much better than a human being can.
Interesting.
We just don't think of them as that capable, and yet there are certain respects in which they're much more capable than we are in things that we associate with being human, like being able to think.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, there's the basic things of like the robots. Like pretty much all vertebrate creatures are more impressive than robots right now. Even really simple ones. They can do stuff that robots can't do. But yeah, even in terms of intelligence, we humans have to be a little bit humble in the world. we can't go around thinking that we're the only ones who have this intelligence. It's quite clearly not the case.
John LeCun is the question of AGI kind of irritates him because he points out that human intelligence is not general. Human intelligence, it feels general to us because it's adapted to everything that we want to do, and that's what it's evolved to do. But it's not any good at doing any of the things that humans don't want to do. We just don't see the limitations of generality because we are what we are. But like he likes to point out that it's not general at all. Like human intelligence is terrible at all kinds of things. So if you want to talk about general intelligence, like don't use humans as a benchmark.
Right. That's actually probably a great place to end because I actually wanted to touch on that. And I think a lot of people conflate like Teslabot with AGI. And absolutely, those two things do not have to come together. We can have an incredibly valuable, effective robot that can be narrow AI, right? It does what tasks it does, and it does them really, really well. And it doesn't have to have any consciousness, any concept of self beyond the fact that it just understands that it takes up space and things. But
AI can become dramatically superhuman in all of the functional aspects, all the things we want it to do, and yet never be able to do never do what most people think of as AGI, which is pretend it's a human, right?
Although eventually, if we get good enough language models, it will absolutely convince us that it's conscious.
Yeah. No, that'll totally happen. In fact, it'll probably happen. I thought for a long time that we wouldn't end up getting robots, or we wouldn't get AIs that mimicked human beings unless we decided to do it, because like machines don't need to follow the same sort of developmental path that human beings do, and we don't need to be along that line. But an interesting thing happened on the way to the bank, which was that it turned out that human beings produce so much of the training data, right? So language models become chatbots really effectively, and they mimic humans when they become chatbots because they're trained on all this data that humans sort of produce. So like in a weird way, we kind of accidentally got robots that pretend they're like us because we generate all the data that they train on, right?
I guess that's true.
So maybe
essentially
we will.
It's just scraping the internet, and the internet is human produced for the most part. So yeah.
And so if we want to, I mean, the people who do some of the most interesting sort of robot locomotion training stuff, they do it from human motion capture, right? So they put a human in a motion capture suit, and then they have them, go someplace and do jumping jacks or karate or jump rope or something like that. And then you train the robot to do it from their motion capture data. Well, it might not be the best way to do it. I mean, it's, we're literally capturing the data right off of a human being, right? So of course the robot ends up mimicking the human being, right? It's not because that's necessarily the optimal way for the robot to do the same activity, but it's the way it's getting trained to do it. Like we're producing the data that it mimics. So for robots to interact with building models that include things as an element of the world model, And so if they need to develop a good model of human beings, they may well get to the point where they understand emotions just fine. Like, I wouldn't normally have thought of emotion as something that would be a natural part of the development of robots. But depending on the development path we do for them, they might end up with it.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Or again, at least project it to us in such a way that we think that they're emoting. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to a question of if they're good enough at telling us that they're doing this thing, we have no way of proof. It's just like I can't prove that you're conscious ultimately, right? Could be a solipsistic universe that only exists for me or for you in your case. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, it'll come down to the robots may tell us that they're conscious and that they have emotions and things like that, and we'll have no way of disproving that.
They will totally convince us that they are, right? Because there will be people who want that. I mean, somebody somewhere is going to put the effort into developing that, and there will be. Now, will they actually have an inner life? And will they experience the quality of depression in the same way that human beings do? I don't know. Maybe.
Right.
Maybe they do.
Man. And ultimately, it really doesn't even matter anymore. It's like once you get to that point, we have to interact with them as if they have those things. Because if they're
that's the way we like to build our world, right? Humans care about fairness. We have to build a world that's fair in order to help everybody reach their potential. Right. And we will project that on machines too, even if the machines don't need it. We won't feel right unless we treat them, we live in a two-tier world. There's humans and there's everything else. Everything else you can treat like garbage, but you have to be nice to the people.
Right? Well, I don't know if that's true.
So once
I probably treat my dogs better
like
than my people. So but we pick things out, yes, that we treat very well. So that is, yeah. But definitely, I mean, if they're inhabiting human space, we already love to anthropomorphize things anyway, and you've got something that looks like a person. So
yeah, try to take a kid's doll, right?
Oh, geez. Not bad times ensue after that. So all right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you again so much for this conversation. It's really fantastic to get a chance. Yeah. And as always, I hope for the next time that we can continue talking. And after AI Day, we'll maybe have to do another one after AI Day Part 2, and we'll have to see.
Excited to see that.
Yeah, so we'll have to see how well we predicted things or what sort of stuff we're like, holy crap, what this actually happened? Did we just see that? So that'll be fantastic. And in the meantime, I really do appreciate it again. And
all the reading of the tea leaves after we get to see.
That's what we do because we have 6 weeks or 8 weeks with nothing to go on until then. So
right. Even more fun afterwards. Yeah.
Exactly. All righty, folks. Take care, everybody. Have a great evening or afternoon or morning, whatever time you're watching it. Okay, bye-bye.